Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Field Organizing at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're going to give it a moment or two for folks to join on the line before we get started. So we'll just put it on pause and we'll be back in about 1 minute. Okay, wonderful. Thanks everybody for joining on the line. As I mentioned before, I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Field Organizing at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. This is our National HoUSed campaign call. And for those of you who may not have joined before, our HoUSed campaign is really focused on advancing anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale sustained investments and reforms that we need to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable, accessible place to call home in communities of their choice. And we launched this campaign because we recognize more than ever we really need bold policy solutions to ensure that everybody, including those who are the most marginalized, have a stable, affordable home. So thank you for joining today's call. We're going to have a great set of speakers with us today. And I know that many of you are really active in your local communities. On the line, we have folks who are advocates from across the nation, including homeless shelter and service providers, housing providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income renters, either who are receiving federal assistance or in need of federal assistance. We also have people who are experiencing homelessness, folks who represent philanthropy and media on the call. So a really broad array of stakeholders who've joined us. I see a lot of people are putting their information in the chat box, so I want to encourage you to say hello from your city and state. Let us know that you're here. On today's call, we're going to hear from some great speakers, as I mentioned before. We're going to get an update from Lily Millwit from the National Homelessness Law Center on trends that they're seeing in the criminalization of homelessness, an issue that we're very concerned about and also seeing crop up in communities across the country. Jenny Huang from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is going to share updates about ways people can better access the expanded child tax credit, which is an important resource that people have been using to pay for their rent and housing over the last several months. We're going to hear updates from the field and also get the latest from our Erase team, which is the End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project team, who will tell us what is happening with the Treasury Emergency Rental Assistance Program, including new updates on spending and demographic information. And then we'll hear from Capitol Hill with our own Kim Johnson, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, about what are the sort of housing investments that are being discussed in the reconciliation bill, what's happening with FY23 spending bill, and with the Eviction Crisis Act, and how all of us can be engaging with members of Congress on all three of those. Before we jump into the agenda, I do want to remind folks that they can ask questions in the Q&A box. It's a lot easier for us to follow your questions and ask those questions to speakers when they're in the Q&A box instead of the chat box. Sometimes it's hard to keep track of all the great conversations that's happening there. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can throughout the afternoon. And then finally, we'll also be sending everybody a copy of this PowerPoint, along with any of the materials that our speakers mentioned in their presentations. We'll send that to you so that you have those resources on hand too. So let's go ahead and get started. Our first speaker, Lily Millwit, is with the National Homelessness Law Center, and she's going to share with us a little bit more about what she's been seeing and what the organization has been seeing when it comes to the criminalization of homelessness. So thank you, Lily, for joining us.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so as Sarah mentioned, I'm the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign manager at the National Homelessness Law Center. I'll speak a little bit in my presentation about what the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign is and sort of what that entails, but I was asked to come and speak today about trends in the criminalization of homelessness. Folks who have potentially noticed that criminalization of homelessness is happening more and more in their jurisdictions are not mistaken, unfortunately. We have been seeing sort of upticks in these types of laws and policies, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that might be and how folks on the call who are interested in getting involved in our efforts to end this really troubling trend can help us do that. So I think the slides are just embedded in here. We can start on the next slide. So just a quick sort of overview on what criminalization is, because we do hear it as kind of a buzzword. The Law Center defines criminalization as policies that restrict or prohibit different categories of conduct performed by people experiencing homelessness. These types of categories of conduct include sleeping, sitting, lying, and down, asking for donations, and living in vehicles within public space. What you'll notice about this definition is that it encompasses kinds of policies that prohibit activities that those of us who are traditionally housed take for granted, those kinds of activities that are life-sustaining activities and activities that all of us do on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis that are very much necessary for us to participate in our own lives. And when we talk about criminalization, we're talking about policies that make it illegal or unlawful or otherwise very difficult for homeless folks to do those activities. We can go to the next slide. So the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign was formed by the National Homelessness Law Center in 2015 as sort of a response to criminalization. It is a coalition of litigators, advocates, and activists. I know many of you on the call are a part of this coalition. You might be a part of the listserv that receives our criminalization news and updates. We also operate several networks, a policy network, as well as a network of litigators called the Housing Not Handcuffs Justice Network that sort of tries to build capacity among folks working in silo or working as sort of solo practitioners or the only person in their office working on these types of issues. And we sort of try and build bandwidth through that justice network. We also have a series of webinars and reports, which I'll talk a little bit about in this slide. But if you're interested in learning more about any of these sort of facets of the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign or just joining the listserv, feel free to shoot me an email. My email's at the end of this presentation, and I'll also throw it in the chat when I finish up. And we can go to the next slide. So the National Homelessness Law Center and the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign put out every other year a report on trends and the criminalization of homelessness in cities. The last time we did this report is 2019. We started doing it in 2006, and what's notable in our 2019 report is that there are increases in every category of criminalization since 2006 across all jurisdictions, and we track those policies across 187 towns and cities in the country and try and get sort of a diverse landscape and picture to get what we think is a pretty complete picture. So just some highlights here: 72% of cities have at least one law prohibiting camping in public. 51% of cities have at least one law prohibiting sleeping in public, and 55% of cities have one or more laws prohibiting sitting and or lying down in public. We can go to the next slide. And just continued here, some are the other categories that we track. And again, this isn't all of the categories that we track, but just some of the key ones. 35% of cities have one or more laws prohibiting loitering, loafing, and or vagrancy. And that's one in particular that we see really deployed and utilized as a means of sort of criminalizing people for existing in public spaces, just for sort of being there. 83% of cities have at least one law restricting begging in public, so asking for food or donations. And those are often also extended to people who are the ones donating or sharing food. They can also sometimes be criminalized under these types of statutes. And 50% of cities have at least one law restricting living in vehicles. That category in particular has been more than a 200% increase since we first started tracking these laws in 2006. So the vehicle habitation ordinances are ones of particular interest to us. And the Law Center is working on building out some working groups to focus on that, if anyone's interested. In 2021, we put out our first supplement to the Housing Not Handcuffs report, which tracks criminalization of homelessness at the state level. I won't read all of these because I've linked here where you can access that state supplement, and I'll also put it in the chat or someone else will. But the top line is that 48 states and the District of Columbia have at least one law at the state level criminalizing homelessness. And I just put here the camping bans, but we also found that states at the state level have bans on panhandling, bans on asking for food and donations in public, bans on living in vehicles and things like that. You can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to talk also about the way that criminalization happens at the informal level through executive action and through policy choices. So at the Law Center, we track officially policy, statutes, ordinances, things that can be found, in cities and states, state codes, annotated codes, and state statutes. But we also see criminalization happening in more informal, sort of insidious ways. These are all headlines that I pulled just from the last month or so, just to show sort of how pervasive this type of criminalization is. So you see in places like DC, San Diego, Asheville, Denver, Austin, there's encampment sweeps happening all the time. And those often look like police showing up, issuing tickets, citations, or just, harassing folks living in encampments, telling them that they need to leave. And the presence of police, can be very criminalizing as well. And we're seeing cities at the informal level, institute these kind of executive programs that make it not necessarily a crime per se, but make it very, very legally and logistically difficult for people to exist while being unhoused, and especially while being unsheltered. And so we just wanted to flag that these types of programs and sweeps are not necessarily showing up in the codes and state statutes and ordinances that we track, but they're happening everywhere. And they're happening in blue states and red states, in places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. In New York City, for instance, right now, there's sweeps happening really, really pervasively across the entire city. So just wanted to flag that criminalization is happening in all sorts of ways. Next slide. So we can't talk about criminalization without talking about the ways in which criminalization harms Black, Indigenous, and people of color more than white people. So we know already that people of color are disproportionately more likely to experience homelessness and to experience unsheltered homelessness. And that is, because of structural racism and unemployment and barriers to education and access to cash assistance and all these kinds of sort of structural things that happen way before homelessness necessarily even happens. And there's tons of resources and materials on that. This resource in particular is one that was created by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area in 2020. And they found that Black adults are up to 9.7 times more likely to receive citations under these kind of criminalizing laws than white adults are. Latinx adults are up to 5.8 times more likely to receive citations than white adults. And these are talking about citations that are geared toward people who are unhoused. So those kind of ordinances that make it illegal to sleep in public, to beg for food or donations in public and things like that. And there's no real way of knowing the extent to which these racial disparities play out in threats, harassment, and informal enforcement, as we talked about. So, we have or some jurisdictions, not even all jurisdictions, some jurisdictions keep track of the housing status of people who are arrested or cited under these types of laws. Some don't, but they're really only tracking people that are ticketed, cited, or actually arrested, and not necessarily people who are under the threat of prosecution or under the threat of being arrested or ticketed, people who are harassed by law enforcement, and people who are just, told under the threat of arrest that they need to leave or to not exist. And I just because I saw this pop up in the chat, that report is from the San Francisco Bay Area Lawyers Committee, and I can link the report in the chat afterwards. So it's important to talk about some of the consequences of criminalization. Those of us who work in fair housing and racial justice and anti-homelessness work, sort of common sense would tell us that criminalization is bad, but it's important to actually think about what happens when someone is criminalized solely for being unhoused. So obviously there's trauma involved with being arrested, being ticketed, being harassed. That trauma can play out in a lot of ways. It can be psychological. It can create mental health barriers. It can create physical health barriers. So, trauma is a big thing. It can also lead to distrust of services and distrust of law enforcement, even more so than what is already there. It can erode sort of any trust that has been built between state agencies and state actors and unhoused communities. It can disconnect people from services and community because they have to often leave where they are living, which is probably where they have friends, where they have family, where they have a network of people they can trust, and probably where they access services, things like mutual aid, things like food banks, things like healthcare. There are physical effects to people being forced to move all the time and people not being able to have access to shelter and access to basic human dignity and things that they need. It exacerbates poverty because in the long run, you are only disconnecting people from their services and you're disconnecting people from communities and from any chance of sort of stabilizing and being able to potentially maybe get housed. And then, of course, you are giving people a criminal record when you arrest them, ticket them, cite them for just existing in public spaces while being unsheltered or while otherwise being unhoused. And then in turn, that creates barriers to employment and housing. So you can sort of see how this criminalization trend creates a cycle of homelessness and poverty. It's really, beyond common sense when you actually look at what happens on the ground when someone gets ticketed, arrested, or fined for being unhoused. It is only creating a cycle of more homelessness and more poverty. Next slide. So some proposed policy solutions that the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign has is this Housing Not Handcuffs model legislation. So this is just a screenshot of where it can be found on our website. It's housingnothandcuffs.org/policy solutions. And I have the links in a later slide in a little bit. But basically this model legislation that we created using a working group of people from different sort of stakeholder groups across the country has three sort of prongs to it. One is shorten homelessness by stopping its criminalization. And you'll see in this first bullet what that looks like. So model legislation would sort of proactively say that no person shall be subject to or threatened with civil or criminal sanctions or harassment by law enforcement or other state actors or private security retained by public actors for moving, resting, sitting, standing, lying down, sleeping, or conducting other life-sustaining activities on public property. The second prong of this proposed policy solution is to prevent homelessness by strengthening housing protections and eliminating unjust evictions. This is sort of more NLIHC's bread and butter around, really making sure that people who are housed and who are precariously housed are able to retain and maintain that housing and are not going to be evicted and are not going to be pushed into homelessness by unjust policies, evictions without cause, that if they are facing eviction, that they have right to counsel and things like that. And then the last prong is to end homelessness by increasing access to and availability of affordable housing. And so that goes to sort of some of the National Homelessness Law Center's housing work, making sure that federal property is being utilized according to Section 5 of the McKinney-Vento Act, that can be utilized to create more spaces for affordable housing, that cities are really living up to any promises that they make around supplying affordable housing, and that people who qualify for housing choice vouchers and other federal programs are able to access those programs and able to become housed. And then another proposed solution is litigation. And the Law Center does engage in a fair amount of litigation. We recently put out this litigation manual supplement that talks about litigation trends. And you can see here that litigation is actually quite quite effective. So 60% of cases challenging panhandling have been successful, 60% of cases challenging camping have been successful, 77% of cases challenging loitering, and 66% of cases challenging food sharing. Next slide. So here's just some resources from the Law Center and next steps. Again, I think this is going to be sent out, so you can click on all the links from when it's sent out, but here's sort of all of the resources that the Law Center and the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign have, webinars, calls to action, policy solutions. We have comms toolboxes, litigation toolboxes, organizing toolboxes. Pretty much everything you can think of is available somewhere on our website. And if you go just to this last slide, there's my email address, and Tristia, our litigation director's email address. So please feel free to email me with any follow-up questions. If you need help accessing any of those resources, if you want to get involved in any of the projects that I mentioned. There's a lot more to talk about that we weren't able to cover today, but I'm always happy to chat about criminalization and what we can do. So feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you so much for your presentation, Lily. We do have a couple of questions I thought we could try to get to. First question is from Lori Jacobs, who asked whether or not you're familiar with the local ordinance in LA that passed that prevents people from sleeping, camping, being on public property. And they say that they're offering housing, but they're really only offering congregate shelters. Are you familiar with that ordinance and what it does?
I am, yeah, and unfortunately that type of ordinance is really not uncommon. We've had a lot of litigation in LA County and city, and they always manage to find a way to re-put out their policies with just, slight word changes and things like that. I don't think there's enough time right now to talk about sort of what the precedent is in the Ninth Circuit and how cities are managing to get around it, but long story short, if they are providing congregate shelter, even if it's congregate shelter, which the Law Center does not believe is adequate housing or an adequate solution to homelessness, but if a city can prove that they have enough shelter beds for people who are unsheltered, then they are technically in the Ninth Circuit allowed to enforce those ordinances, and it is not unconstitutional, but we do engage in a lot of policy advocacy and litigation to try and make sure that congregate shelter is not the only alternative being provided to people experiencing unsheltered homelessness.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lily. We also have a question from Sarah Hasmer about whether you or any other organization have a consolidated tracker of where sweeps are happening. Do you know of that resource?
So we do have a consolidated tracker of where criminalization is happening, and that was on the resources page, and it's a map that's sort of an interactive map of where you can look at different policies that criminalize camping or sleeping outside. We don't have one that's focused specifically on where sweeps are happening. That's something that I will definitely flag to folks that maybe we could work on. Unfortunately, sweeps are happening really under the table, sometimes in the middle of the night. And sometimes really quickly in one place, and then they move people to another location and then sweep them there, and so it's all happening in a really sort of informal, insidious and dangerous way that may make it difficult to track in real time, but it's not a bad idea to sort of have a resource available that at least shows where sweeps have happened, or where we know sometimes they do announce when sweeps are going to happen. So I will definitely consider that. Thank you.
We have to move on to our other speakers, but I want to thank you, Lily. And if you're able to stay on and answer some of the questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, that'd be super helpful. I know that we really appreciate the work that the Homelessness Law Center is doing around this, and are starting to see more and more bills popping up that would criminalize homelessness or focus on not actual solutions to homelessness, and this is part of it. So thank you for your work on this. I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, Jenny Huang from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who's going to talk about how folks can be accessing the expanded child tax credit. I'll turn it over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lily. I learned so much. I am so excited to talk to you all today about the child tax credit and what folks can do to help get people connected to these payments, even after the tax season is over. So if you can go to the next slide. So I am Jenny Huang. I'm an outreach manager at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I work for the Get It Back campaign, which is the project at the center. We are a national effort to connect eligible people to tax benefits. So we usually focus on promoting the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, free tax preparation, and other tax benefits. And we do this by working with a large network of diverse partners who do local tax credit outreach. Next slide. So in the past 2 years, because of the COVID pandemic, we've really focused on the kind of like expanded tax credits that came out of like COVID relief. So we focused on the the three stimulus checks that came out the past couple of years, as well as the expanded child tax credit and the expanded earned income tax credit. So kind of how this work has looked in the past couple of years is we've really divided our work into a few different buckets. So the first two buckets that people really see are we provide outreach resources and materials both for organizations and for government agencies. And then we also, oh, thank you, Kim, for dropping in the link to our website. We also conduct trainings and webinars throughout the year to support these organizations in their outreach. And then we do some limited technical assistance for partners. So if you're thinking about like what you could be doing in your outreach and not really sure how to plan, feel free to reach out to me. I will drop my email in the chat later. And yeah, we can get on the phone and talk about that. And then kind of a little more behind the scenes, we do some pitching to local media, digital advertising, and PSAs to get the word out that way. Next slide, please. So even though the tax season, even though the tax deadline has passed April 15th, or I guess this past year it was April 18th, it does not mean that it is too late to file. In fact, what we are really focusing on post-tax season is really getting the word out that it is not too late. And so I'm just really excited to be talking to you all today. I was looking in the chat to see where folks are joining from. And I think a lot of the clients and the folks that you all work with are the people that we really, really desperately want to reach and make sure are getting both the third stimulus check as well as the child tax credit. So what we are just so excited about is Code for America, one of our closest partners, is just about to launch getctc.org. So you may remember the previous iteration of getctc.org from last year. Basically, it is a simplified tax filing process. It only takes about 15 minutes, and almost everyone is able to use this tool without any external help. So that's kind of amazing, because I know that for a lot of organizations, right, like many people just don't have the capacity to like take people through a tax filing process or like answer a ton of questions. But luckily, getctc.org is just so simple that almost anyone can use it. It's very mobile friendly, and it's available in English and Spanish. And so this tool is really for people who do not normally file taxes. So it's folks with a household income of under $25,000 or under about $12,500 if for those who are filing individually. It does have some limitations. So this tool is really only available right now for tax year 2021. So folks are able to get their child tax credit and the third stimulus payment, but to get the first two stimulus payments or the earned income tax credit, you really do need to file a full tax return. But for everyone who is able to, who does want to get the child tax credit or the third stimulus payment, this tool is just phenomenal, and we're just really excited to promote it. And so on this next slide, I just wanted to quickly go through a little bit. I'm not going to go through it long, but basically the child tax credit and third stimulus payment are the benefits that you can get from this tool. So the child tax credit, what's really special about the expanded CTC is really that it's worth just a lot more money than it was in previous years. So the expansion made it worth up to $3,600 for kids less than 6 years old and $3,000 for kids between 6 and 17, which is almost, it's almost double what it used to be worth, right? It used to be worth up to $2,000. And so I'm not gonna read through all the eligibility, but the other thing that's really great about it is that the expanded CTC doesn't have any income requirement. So you can get it even with no income. And any parents or guardians with kids who have an SSN can get the child tax credit even if they themselves do not have an SSN and only have an ITIN. So again, this is just summarizing what's new about the CTC. The most important part is really that it is just such a large credit compared to what it used to be worth. Yeah, and then on the next slide, you'll see just again a little bit on the third stimulus check. So the third stimulus check was worth $1,400 for each eligible person within the household, the tax filing household. Next slide. I think we can skip this one. So we are very excited to partner with Code for America, Coalition on Human Needs, and the Partnership for America's Children. We will be hosting a webinar next Thursday, May 19th from 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time to talk more about the relaunch of Get CTC and also go over in a lot more detail how you can support folks in getting their tax credits, as well as like what are the other options in case someone does not qualify for getctc.org. And so I will drop the registration link in the chat if you're interested in joining us. That's next Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And we're so excited. We're going to actually have live interpretation so that you can have it in English or Spanish at the same time. So pretty exciting stuff. Next slide. And then I also wanted to touch on the outreach materials that we're creating. So we already have a toolkit for the child tax credit, but we are revamping the toolkit now to really focus on driving people to getctc.org. So we have everything from messaging and earned media materials to a social media toolkit you can use, call and text scripts and newsletter copy, and flyer and mailer. And the flyer and mailer are translated into 5 different languages. So we wanted to have a suite of turnkey materials that you can just like start using immediately in your outreach. On the next slide, I wanted to just share an example of the kind of language and messaging we have within the toolkit. So really want to focus on that message that it is not too late to file and claim the child tax credit, even though the tax season has ended, and driving people again over to that simplified filing process at getctc.org. And I will put a link into the toolkit specifically after I'm done talking. Oh, wow. That was, I guess that's it. I thought I had put in, is there any more slide after this? I thought I had put in an example of the flyer, but I might not have.
Nope, just this.
Nope. This is, okay, never mind. Well, I will drop a link into the current toolkit and you can check it out if you're interested in seeing the flyer and poster and other materials that will be translated soon.
Thank you so much, Jenny. This is really helpful information. I'm sure there are a lot of folks who are on our call today who either could benefit from this tax credit or could help others in their community learn about how they can get their tax credit. I'm wondering, there are a couple questions in the chat box. One is, do you know if the webinar or if the training is going to cover anything for families who missed the tax deadline? How would they, do you have resources for how those folks can access the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, the dependent care tax credits, et cetera?
Yeah, so the tax deadline, it's interesting because it actually doesn't affect a lot of people. There are really only penalties if you owe taxes. So if you don't owe taxes, and for a lot of people who get the tax credits, there's really no penalty for filing afterwards. And most filing resources are going to be available until early November. So if you or someone you know only needs to get the child tax credit and the third stimulus check, then Get CTC is an amazing resource because it's quick and easy. But for everyone else, we recommend going to getyourrefund.org. If you go through getyourrefund.org, there's a couple options there. You can either file a full tax return with help with one of their tax preparers, or they also have a DIY process that people can use. And again, those resources will all be available at least through the middle of October. So I will drop a link for getyourrefund.org as well, but that's where we are directing people.
Thank you so much, Jenny. I also had a question about, a good way to reach people who might be eligible for these resources is to go through, public housing agencies. They touch a lot of households, or even continuums of care who might work with people experiencing homelessness. Do you know if there's any effort to engage with, those different types of groups to reach out to low-income renters and people who are homeless?
Yeah, I mean, there are amazing outreach efforts that are happening. There's great work happening in Seattle that I know of. There are folks that we've talked to in Seattle who were out there with like tablets, helping people fill out those forms every day. So that's a great way to do it. But really, like anyone who can access like a phone or borrow a phone or anything like that can really, it's really easy to fill out getctc.org. So yeah, great. There's already tons of great outreach happening, but I would have to do a little more digging to give some more examples of specifically what's happening post-tax season this year.
Okay, great. And do you know if you happen to need a permanent address in order to receive your tax credit, or how does that work?
Yes, so you do not, but you would need somewhere for the money to be deposited, if not. So what we will sometimes recommend is there is actually a way to use Cash App. And so I know like with Venmo and PayPal, you usually have to connect it to a bank account, but with Cash App, you do not need to connect it with a bank account. And you can actually get a direct, like a routing number and account number through your Cash App account. Or you can use like a prepaid debit card or something like that. But I know a lot of people already have Cash App. So that's actually a pretty good way to get the stimulus or the CTC money if you don't have a bank account and don't have a permanent address.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I learned so much. I'm hoping that folks will use this time. You said November is the deadline. Is that right?
It's kind of confusing. Usually the IRS does not close its system until early November, but we don't have a specific date for that. So GetCTC will be open until early November whenever the IRS closes its systems. But if you are doing it through getyourrefund.org, they're closing their full service October 1st. So you do need to do that a little bit earlier.
Great. So that's a good reminder for folks to get started earlier rather than later. And maybe we'll have you on again as we get closer to those deadlines.
Amazing.
Thanks for joining. And if you're able to answer other folks' questions in the Q&A box, I don't see any in the Q&A box, but there might be some in the chat box. If you have a second to help answer some of those questions, that'd be great. Thanks for joining, Jenny.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay, great. We're going to move on now to our field updates. Our first update will be from Alexa Johnson with the Housing Resource Center of Monterey County, California. Thanks, Alexa.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is Alexa Johnson, and I've recently been promoted to executive director. I should have changed that, but I am the executive director here at Housing Resource Center. So we help those who are homeless or at risk of becoming homeless find housing within Monterey County and San Benito County in California. And I'm going to talk to you today about a program we've started that we have called the Landlord Gold Standard. So if you want to go to the next slide there, I guess the next slide after that. There we go. Thank you. So you might have heard of a gold standard, you might have not, but if you have, you've probably heard it from the Ritz-Carlton. So the Ritz-Carlton has an employee promise that fosters a work environment where diversity is valued, quality of life is enhanced, individual aspirations are fulfilled, and the Ritz-Carlton mystique is strengthened. So part of that employee promise, if you go to the next slide here, is also extended to their customers that they serve. And within their standard, they call it the 2000 rule. So the most well-known measure taken by the Ritz-Carlton is called the 2000 rule. According to that rule, every employee of the hotel is allowed to spend up to $2,000 to what they call rescue the guest experience without having to ask any manager. So importantly, employees can spend that amount per incident, per client, to make sure that the client has the best experience possible while at the Ritz-Carlton. So their meal isn't quite to their standards, their hotel room isn't quite to their standards. If there's anything that an employee can do to quickly rescue that guest experience under the $2,000 limit, they're able to do without any manager approval. If you can go to the next slide for me. So the reason why I tell you all this is because we at HRC thought, why should this concept be applied just to hotels? Why shouldn't we apply this concept elsewhere? And I'm sure, as a lot of you know, housing is very difficult right now for us nationwide. And I know in Monterey County specifically, there's a lot of conversation around we need to build affordable housing, we need to build affordable housing. And for us at HRC, we realize while affordable housing is really important, that's not going to help us right here, right now. This pandemic has really affected our community and people need to get housed right away. So what that tells us is that we really have to invest in our landlord relationships and make sure that our landlords feel like they're a priority to us. In working with us, there's not this financial risk that they're taking, and that we're not going to, quote unquote, leave them high and dry if they take one of our clients and they've successfully completed the program and we close their case. We're not going to say, oh, now that's your problem, you have to deal with it. So we try to take this landlord gold standard program and model it after the gold standard program at the Ritz-Carlton, so that way our staff can be empowered to kind of make sure that our landlords feel satisfied when they're working with our agency. Because who other than our staff can ensure landlords are taken care of? Our staff is the ones that work with the landlords directly. They're the ones that work with our clients directly. So they know the concerns in the community. They know the barriers that we're facing, and they know what landlords need to hear or need to have from us at our agency in order to feel secure in working with us. If you go to our next slide here. So I just love, I love this picture because it was one of our former clients and he just takes the best photos. So I just put him in every presentation I have because he's got the style. So HRC's gold standard program, what we've decided is that HRC will pay up to $500 for a first-time landlord to work with our program. So they work with our program, they accept any of our tenants. Tenants are moving in, automatically there's a $500 incentive that we give the landlord in working with us. And then we allow for up to $1,000 for minor repairs that need to be done to the unit. Whether or not these damages were caused by one of our clients doesn't matter. The idea behind it is we're promoting higher quality units for our clients and for our community. I don't know if other areas in our nation have the same struggle, but we have a lot of units that just are not high quality. They're not really up to code, yet the rent is astronomical. And so we're having our folks struggling to pay their rent in a unit that, has backed up sinks or has leaks. And that's not really a safe or, an ideal living environment for anybody. And so we want to make sure that if there are any minor repairs that need to be done prior to us doing our inspection or housing authority doing their inspection, or just in general to make the unit, more appealing, we could do up to $1,000 for any of those repairs. On top of that as well, we've just recently added in there up to $1,000 if there's any rental arrears that was owed to that landlord, whether or not they were a client of ours. If the client, if the landlord has had a bad experience with a tenant, maybe they're thinking of selling their unit and not even renting anymore. And if we could say, well, we could pay up to $1,000 of the rental arrears that were owed to you, provided you show us the ledger and the lease and all that information. It's not always going to solve the rental arrears they may have, but at least it shows that we're trying to work with them and be an ally with them when it comes to housing. And that, in working with us, we can provide financial incentives as well alongside making sure that rent is paid on time, and that we're there for case management and any sort of mediation. But the idea behind this is that staff would not need to ask management for this service to landlords. It could be provided on the spot when speaking with the landlord and discussing housing placements. Housing can come and go very quickly, and so our staff needs to act fast. And if they're waiting for management to approve a sort of an expense that we've already allocated as something that's acceptable within that dollar limit, then we want staff to be able to feel empowered and say, yeah, absolutely, we could take care of that damaged sink for you, no problem. We could take care of the sink, and oh, there was some rental arrears owed. Okay, well, with the proper documentation, we could pay up to $1,000 for any rental arrears that were owed. And so staff would be able to negotiate on the spot with landlords, which is really important because time is everything, and our clients are actually competing with other tenants that can make that decision right up front, right? Whether or not they can move in. And so we want to make sure that we're smart and effective in making sure that landlords feel like working with us is a good experience. And then also, this can be used for a landlord, like I said, that has any additional funds outside of security deposit or additional repairs. And if we can go to the next slide here. So a lot of people are just asking about partnering licensed vendors. So we do make sure we get our own vendors, that they're all licensed, and working with vendors. Sometimes they will adjust the cost for us and make sure that the cost is reasonable. And when appropriate and possible, they'll try to apply those discounted rates. If you can go on the next slide for me. And then this is just the benefits of our gold standard. It really improves that agency-landlord relationship. It helps encourage our landlords to participate in housing our homeless clients, and it really helps to alleviate the financial risk in working with our homeless agencies. And next slide. So I think that is the end of my presentation on our landlord gold standard. And I did leave my information there as well, if anybody has any further questions.
Yeah, thank you, Alexa. It's very interesting work. There's lots of questions coming in. I think folks wanted to know, where is it that what federal, state, or local resources are you using to help pay for the cost of this program?
So we started by using our state funding to take care of any sort of landlord mitigation funds. So any damages to units, that's kind of the main way it had been used. And then over time, we realized we need to have more flexibility. And so we actually will put in grant requests and use unrestricted funding to be able to fund that program so we can be flexible in how to use it.
Another question that came in from, I'm going to mispronounce his name, I'm going to skip it. Another question that came in is whether, there's relatively small dollar amounts that we're talking about here, $500 or $1,000. Is that enough for you to see an enticement of new landlords to work with you? Or is this really about providing a benefit to maybe the existing set of landlords that are working with you?
I will say it has improved new landlords. Our county is kind of unique in that all of the rapid rehousing agencies and housing authority have all come together to agree across the board how much a new landlord incentive would be. So no one agency is providing more of an incentive than others. So 500 has been the limit, and so that's kind of what we set it at. The $1,000 for damages and arrears is what we have it at right now, just based off of the funding that we have. But our goal is, as our funding increases, so would those dollar amounts as well.
Very, very interesting. I'd love to hear more from you as you're looking back on the program after some time. I know that folks are looking at things at the federal level, but there's always this balance between resources that could be used to house people versus landlord incentives, and how much would it cost to actually recruit new landlords? Is it working to recruit new landlords? So your experiment here is super helpful in our thinking, and we really appreciate you joining us. There's also a question about whether or not the information about your program is available on your website, or if that's something that you can share a link to in the chat box.
I could share a link to the flyer that we have. We don't necessarily have the gold standard on our website, but I could share a link to the flyer so that way people can use it as a reference.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. We're going to go to our next speaker now. This is Jacqueline Simone from the Coalition for the Homeless, and she's going to give us an update about things in her community. Thanks, Jacqueline.
Hi, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you great.
Excellent. So my name is Jacqueline Simone. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the policy director at the Coalition for the Homeless in New York City. We've been around for 41 years, and every year we put out a report called State of the Homeless that is really a snapshot of how the city and the state are doing to address homelessness in New York. You know, we at the Coalition do both direct services through 11 different programs, meeting people's immediate needs, doing things like a mobile soup kitchen, job training, crisis services. And then we use the lessons that we learned from serving about 3,500 homeless and extremely low income New Yorkers every single day to inform our advocacy work. So the State of the Homeless report is sort of the culmination of what we've learned through our on the ground work over the past year. And this year's report is called New York at a Crossroads because we have a new mayor and a relatively new governor who can really have an opportunity to pivot away from some of the negative policies and missed opportunities of the prior administrations and really embrace housing as the solution to homelessness. Next slide, please. So just a snapshot of how large the homeless population is in New York City. New York City, for those who don't know, has a right to shelter, and this means that the city is legally obligated to provide a bed in a shelter for anyone who wants and needs it. And this means that the vast majority of our homeless population is indoors in shelters, although we also have a few thousand people who remain unsheltered on the streets, often because they have had negative experiences in the shelter system and find that it does not meet their needs. So we've seen two different trends in just looking at the shelter census lately. As you can see, each night there are almost 20,000 single adults in the main municipal shelter system. Again, this does not include people who are members of families. This does not include people who are unsheltered or people who are in private or faith-based shelters. Next slide, please. But we've also seen that the number of families in shelters has decreased, especially since the start of the pandemic in New York City. So you can see that when New York State's eviction moratorium began in March 2020, we saw a significant decrease for the next several months in the number of families that were sleeping in the main municipal shelter systems on any given night in New York City. And New York's eviction moratorium was allowed to expire in January 2022. So we are starting to see those numbers creep back up. But I think that this chart really shows that, you know, we were experiencing a housing crisis prior to the pandemic. And the only reason that we have not seen a significant increase in the number of people in shelters is because of some of these pandemic era policies, like the eviction moratorium and like the emergency rental assistance program. So unfortunately, we have not seen a commensurate increase in the number of housing resources that can prevent those trends from being reversed, so that we might end up seeing more people become homeless. But it's worth noting that at least, you know, stopping evictions did reduce the number of families who are becoming homeless. Next slide, please. Now, of course, as many of the other speakers have acknowledged, homelessness does disproportionately affect Black and Latinx people, especially in New York City. We see that about 56% of the heads of household of people in the municipal shelter system are Black, which is more than double their share of the overall New York City population. Next slide, please. And the full report, which I encourage everyone reads, does have many different charts analyzing progress when it comes to addressing homelessness over the past year. But this one I wanted to highlight in particular. This shows that last fiscal year, there were a record number of New Yorkers who died while homeless. And that was largely due to an increase in drug-related deaths. I think we're seeing an overdose crisis around the country, both among homeless and stably housed people. But of course, the most vulnerable members of society are often those who are bearing the brunt of these larger trends. And we also did see some COVID deaths as well last year, fewer than the year prior, but still certainly we all say many times that housing is healthcare. And I think that this really heartbreaking chart really highlights that. Next slide, please. So the bulk of the State of the Homeless report consists of a report card where we grade the city and the state on how they've been grappling with this crisis. So this year we broke the categories into a few different subsections. First of all, meeting the needs of unsheltered New Yorkers, again, recognizing that even with that right to shelter, thousands of people are not in shelters, often because they've had negative experiences there, and trying to see how the city and the state are connecting people to low barrier private shelters that they might be more willing to accept, psychiatric care, harm reduction services, restroom access, and of course, making sure that we are not criminalizing unsheltered homelessness, but are instead connecting people to housing and safe shelters. As Lily said, unfortunately in New York City, the new mayoral administration has been doubling down on encampment sweeps. So you'll see that there are really bad grades when it comes to helping unsheltered New Yorkers, lots of D's and F's, rightfully so, I think, given the trend toward criminalization and not recognizing that housing is the answer to homelessness. The next section there is on the shelter system. So in New York City, the main shelter system overseen by the Department of Homeless Services is divided into shelters for single adults, shelters for adult families, and shelters for families with children. So we sort of have a grading matrix here where we graded the access to shelters, the fact that many families are being turned away from shelters, even though they do have a right to shelter. Many families have to submit multiple reapplications before they're finally found eligible for shelter. Looking at the conditions within the shelters, the design of shelters, this is where we talk a lot about the fact that even 2 years into a pandemic, the shelters for single adults tend to be dorm-style congregate facilities rather than recognizing that people need private rooms if they're going to be safe and especially protected from COVID-19. Services in shelters, including Wi-Fi access and the lack of housing search assistance. We're seeing the average length of stay in shelters increase year after year, and people are staying in shelters well over a year and a half on average. The next section is housing. So we're looking at production numbers for affordable housing for extremely low income and homeless New Yorkers. I know this won't be surprising to anyone on the call, but New York, like many other places around the country, is not building enough housing specifically for the people with the greatest needs. Likewise, with supportive housing, we've seen some progress, but there's still significant barriers and administrative hurdles that people face when they're trying to access permanent housing with support services. Looking at housing vouchers and stability, there were some improvements made to New York City's housing vouchers, but unfortunately the state has not stepped up. Looking at enforcement against discrimination in housing. And then finally, we focus on homelessness prevention related to rental assistance, eviction prevention, and institutional discharge policies. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to read through these because for the sake of time, I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for the other speakers. But we have a variety of recommendations for the mayor and the governor related to helping unsheltered New Yorkers. This really goes back to what I was saying about shifting away from criminalization and making sure that people have safe private shelters. Next slide, please. And next slide. Breeze through these. For emergency shelters, again, we need to focus more on private safe shelters, removing barriers to shelter facilities, making sure they're adequately staffed, and shifting away from those congregate facilities. Next slide. And you can go to the next slide. And when it comes to permanent housing and homelessness prevention, we need more coordination between the city and the state, and between the homelessness and housing agencies. We need way more investments in permanent housing for the people with the greatest needs, including supportive housing. Next slide. And you can go to the final slide. We also need more effective reentry planning, because we're seeing far too many people discharged directly from prisons and jails into shelters and to the streets in New York. You can hit the next slide. So I know I went through that very quickly, but there's the link, and I'm sure it'll be in the chat as well, to the full report if you're interested in reading it, and if you have any questions. We do put out this report every year, but I think this year's report in particular is sort of an important snapshot as we deal with the new administration at the city and the state level, and I hope that it is useful in all of your advocacy as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jacqueline. I'm wondering, there are some questions. First, I'm wondering, and I had the same question as somebody who asked this, but you know, there's this huge trend of the increase in homelessness in New York, and it's not a recent trend. It's a trend that goes back. This question at least says from 9/11. I didn't catch the first initial date of your tracking, but it seems like it's a decades-long problem that's continuing to get worse. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, or what are the underlying causes that are, you know, leading to that really strong increase?
Yeah, I mean, if there were an overlay of the trajectory of rents in New York City, you could really map that along with the increase in homelessness. This has been decades in the making. We have seen, you know, fluctuations based on both the economic reality in the city as well as policies from prior administrations. You know, there was a point during the Bloomberg administration where the number of families in shelters really shot up significantly because he thought that people were becoming homeless so that they could get access to permanent housing resources. So he removed priority access to permanent housing for homeless families. And of course, we all know that that's a counterproductive policy. So it's a combination of economic and policy decisions, but I think that it comes down to the lack of affordable housing in New York.
Thanks for that, Jacqueline. Thank you for joining so much. I have so many more questions for you, but I'm going to have to move on to our other speakers, but I will definitely be digging into your report a little bit more after the call, because I think it's really helpful. So thank you for joining us. Appreciate that. If you're able to answer questions in the Q&A box, that would be wonderful, or in the chat box as you see them. Thank you. We're gonna make a little change to our agenda. Our next speaker, Maria, is not on just yet, so we're gonna go to our Erase team, and Rebecca Yeh and Sophie Seablock Glover are going to give us an update about the Treasury ERA program.
Thank you, Sarah, and hello, everybody. You can go to the next slide. My name is Sophie Seablock Glover, and I'm a research specialist focusing on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program here at NLIHC. I'll be talking briefly about new spending data, and my colleague Rebecca will be sharing a few details about demographic data that was released. So the U.S. Department of the Treasury recently released updated Emergency Rental Assistance Program spending data through March 31st, as well as state-level demographic data that was released as a follow-up to the top-line demographic data Treasury released in February. For those interested in looking through the data, I will drop these links into the chat. Next slide. Between January 2021 and March 2022, over 26 billion of ERA1 and ERA2 has been spent on assistance to households, administrative expenses, and housing stability services. About 24.4 billion has been spent on assistance to households alone, and over 5.2 million payments have been made. In March, grantees dispersed about $714 million in ERA1 funds, which brings the total ERA1 dispersed to households to nearly 17 billion. This is about 68% of ERA1 funds allocated. Grantees dispersed about 1.1 billion of ERA2 funds in March, which brings the total ERA2 dispersed to households to nearly 7.3 billion, or 34% of ERA2 funds allocated. I should note that Treasury's data does not include any funds obligated to households, so the amount of funds spent or obligated to households could be much higher than reflected here. Next slide. Since ERA1 started in January of 2021, local grantees have spent a larger share of their ERA1 allocation each month in general. The dark blue bars represent the share of the $5.4 billion of ERA1 funds directly allocated to local grantees spent each month. And the light blue bars represent the share of the $12 billion of ERA1 funds directly allocated to state grantees spent each month. Local grantees steadily increased the percent spent each month, peaking at 13% spent in September of 2021. State grantees followed a similar pattern, steadily increasing the percent spent in early and mid-2021. As you can see, the percent spent by both local grantees and state grantees decreased in the last quarter of 2021 and is lower than previously in the beginning quarter of 2022. This is likely due to an increasing number of state and local grantees exhausting their ERA1 funds and shifting to ERA2 funds. Next slide. Through the end of March, local grantees have spent approximately 35% of the $5.3 billion in their direct ERA2 allocation, and about 123 local grantees have spent 50% or more of their ERA2 allocation. State grantees have spent a similar share of their ERA2 allocation. Through the end of March, state grantees spent approximately 36% of the $15.9 billion allocated. 10 state grantees in the District of Columbia have spent 50% or more of their ERA2 allocation, and 3 state grantees, New Jersey, Oregon, Texas, and the District of Columbia, have spent over 75% of their ERA2 allocation by the end of March. Next slide. For those interested in additional ERA spending resources, NLHC tracks ERA spending through the ERA Spending Tracker and Dashboard. Our tracking integrates Treasury data with real-time data from program dashboards and program administrators to provide a closer estimate of how much ERA2 funding has been spent or obligated to date. I'll drop these links, these resources into the chat. And as always, if you have any questions regarding ERA spending, please don't hesitate to reach out at research@nlihc.org. With that, I'll pass it off to my colleague, Rebecca.
Thanks, Sophie. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Rebecca Yeh. And I'm going to be talking a bit about the new demographics data that Treasury shared. So earlier this year in February, Treasury shared top-line demographics of how ERA1 has been distributed. And last week, they followed up with a new data release showing demographics disaggregated by state, or another way of saying this, we can now take a look at the demographics breakdown of ERA1 recipients state by state in 2021. So just to note, this data does not include DC, territories, or tribal programs. And I also dropped a link in the chat just a few moments ago. Since this is harkening back to things that have happened several months ago, we're well into 2022, I'll share a couple of things to just ground this data first. So in the whole of 2022, around 2.47 million payments had been made through ERA1. Most of that was made by state and local governments. As Sophie was mentioning earlier, spending was uneven between state and local grantees. Local grantees really contributed a lot to payments made and overall expenditures. And the top line data of all this says, of households assisted by ERA1, 49% were Black, 39% were white, 2% were Asian, 2% were Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, and 2% were American Indian or Alaska Native. Treasury also shares the breakdown separately by ethnicity. 1 out of 5 ERA1 recipients also identified as Latino, while 4 of 5 ERA1 recipients did not. To give some additional context, I wanted to share a snapshot of the demographic breakdown of renters in the US. So this chart shows how renters comprise a variety of race or ethnic groups. And as we all know, people of color disproportionately make up renters. and are more likely to be cost burdened and low income. So to follow one of the data points on this on the slide here, so though Black households account for only 12% of all households, they account for 20% of all renter households, 24% of cost burden low-income renters, and 29% of renter households that are behind on rent. Latino households face similar disparities. Latino households make up 13% of all households, but account for 19% of renter households, 22% of cost burden low-income renter households, and 25% of renter households behind on rent. The pandemic exacerbated many pre-existing disparities, and that's why it's so important to be able to understand racial and ethnic disparities. So actually, if we could go back 2 slides, that would be great. So this data really provides a high-level overview, but it doesn't really indicate how individual programs have distributed assistance. The state-by-state demographic data shows a really nuanced and complex picture of how ERA1 has been distributed. So in the US overall, so it really shows a nuanced and complex picture of how ERA1 has been distributed. And I'm actually going to go to an example and take a closer look at Georgia and Arizona. So here we have ERA1 recipients served by both state and local programs in Georgia on the left and Arizona on the right. In Georgia and Arizona, 83% and 31% of households served by ERA1 were Black, though Black households make up 52% and 9% of cost burden low-income renters, and 58% and 18% of renters behind on rent. So on first glance, this might look like programs in both these states are effectively reaching out, but if we dig deeper into the data, we can see that programs in these states made 38,000 and 75,000 payments respectively, and that local programs contributed a majority of these payments, accounting for 62% and 61% of all payments. So performance among local programs which serve more urban areas and diverse populations may bias the aggregated distribution of assistance and explain, for example, these high shares of Black households served within the state overall. And this is why we really need more granular data. So I'm going to skip a few slides to limitations. I'm going to mention the really important one here, which is, as I mentioned earlier, this data provides a high-level overview, but we really don't have a great idea of how individual programs are doing. So the data that's been aggregated to the state level or the national level, they really can be masking important disparities at a more local level, and we really need more granular data to better understand that. So I'm going to conclude there.
Thanks, Rebecca and Sophie, for your updates. I see there are some questions in the chat box. I'd love for you to stay on to answer them. And maybe in our next or in a future call, you can share a little bit more about what this disaggregated data at the local level would help tell us about, which programs are really advancing racial equity, which ones need to do more, and how that information really helps you guys when you're digging into it a little bit deeper. I know we had to cut off a little bit early, but I appreciate you joining and giving us your update. I'm going to move now to our next speaker, Maria, who is from Community Legal Aid in Ohio, and she's going to give an update on where things are in her state. Maria, are you able to join us?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you well. Thank you.
Telling me that I should shut my door. Apologize. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. I was supposed to be joined by one of my friends, Lauren from Fair Housing, who I think frequents these calls, but she unfortunately had some unexpected medical appointments pop up today, and so I'm going to attempt to do her justice today. So we were asked to come and speak about an event that we hosted gosh, 2 weeks ago, I think now, or going on 2 weeks, called the Eviction Prevention Summit. And so this was a collaborative community-wide, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the chat, so I'm going to turn it off. Collaborative community-wide event, and it was like multiple years in the making. So what is now fun history for me to tell, but at the time was frustrating. Back in 2019, we were sort of grappling here in Akron with the numbers from the eviction lab from 2016, showing that our city had the highest eviction rate amongst large cities in the state of Ohio. And so for those who are not familiar with Ohio, you've probably heard tell of Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, the big three. But it was our city of Akron that had higher rates than even those three cities. And so we were trying to grapple with how to address that as a community, especially during a time when no one was really talking about eviction. And so what we decided to do was, hey, let's reach out and see if we could bring Matt Desmond to town. And so our organization contacted him, and Fair Housing called me about a week later and said, hey, we just got off the phone with Matt Desmond's people, and they said, you're interested in bringing him to town. And do you want to talk about what a collaborative event could look like? And so we started planning something and had something scheduled for April of 2020. And then a funny thing happened on the way through the pandemic that made those plans get upended. And it was, I don't want to say a happy accident, because the eviction crisis and how it worsened throughout the course of the pandemic was obviously not a good thing. But what it did in our community was it shifted the tone of the conversation. So eviction went from being something that no one in the public sphere was talking about in Akron to something that, like, you couldn't turn on the news at night or open a paper in the morning without seeing a headline about eviction. And so that gave us an opportunity then, when we said, okay, it's time to revisit bringing him to town, to shift the focus of our event from awareness raising to solution driving. And so the event that we hosted at the end of April brought together all stakeholders. We had, obviously, housing advocates were in attendance and helped plan it. We had tenants and tenant unions here in town that were part of the planning process, and the municipal court, our local municipal court, was on board with participating in the event. We had the city was a partner and a sponsor. City council was there, the mayor's office, local chamber of commerce. We had landlords there. We had landlords actually sponsor the event after doing some significant outreach. And we brought everyone together under the premise that eviction is bad for everyone, and focused more on how can we shift the conversation from evictions are bad to here's what we can do about them. And I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm supposed to be moving the slides, but whoever's moving the slides can, there we go. Thank you. You can go. Oh, I should mention too that this work would not have been possible without, we had some grassroots organizations that were working with, like our organization was working to help build tenant unions along with some local organizing collaboratives. We have an eviction task force that has been in place since I think 2019, that was sort of pushing for some of these conversations to be had behind the scenes. We had some local ordinance passed as a result of the eviction task force, things like pay to stay legislation, income discrimination prevention, and those types of things. And that really laid the foundation for making this event possible as well. If you could go one more. Thank you. So we had, we've collated all of the responses. So the day, it was a full day, sort of like conference style, and it capstoned at the end with what we called roundtable discussions. So all, like, I don't know, 370 some people who were there, we broke them out into randomized groups, and they had to sit around a table and talk about what they learned that day. And every table had to report out 1 to 2 ideas of how they would solve this problem. And so we've collated that data, and this is what we've come up with. There were people these were sort of the categories of that people came up with, either addressing things through our local code, addressing things through the judicial system, some form of public education. And that looked like either tenants' rights education or even like having classes in our local middle and high schools as a requirement to teach people about personal finance and potential home ownership. building referral networks. The program bucket was the largest bucket. It was like specific things that like programs that can be put in place. So like right to counsel, we included as a program, like a pilot program. And then data collection and sort of monitoring this on an ongoing basis. So if you advance one more slide, you'll see the themes. So these were the top, I can't remember if there's 10 or 12, you can count however many are listed there, themes that came out of those recommendations. And so there's interest in the community in having a landlord registry and like put it, to use the phrases that I saw most often, like giving teeth to inspections. There's interest in simplifying and modifying court processes. So everything from making the escrow process simpler to like, how about the average person be able to read and understand a document that they get from the court? There's, interest in having landlord training certification, providing incentives to landlords for doing that training and getting those certifications. Tenant rights, whether it be educating about their rights or supporting organizing tenant unions. Mandatory mediation was a big one. And not just mediation for the sake of mediation, but doing it before an eviction filing happens. Right to counsel was a big one that came out. Education on financial literacy and basic life skills. So like, what do you do if your toilet's overflowing and your landlord's not responsive or something, like quality of life kind of stuff. And also things that you would need to be a homeowner if we're going to promote homeownership, which was later down on the list. Eviction record sealing was on there. And then, examining, there were really specific recommendations about like local codes and ordinances. Yes, I can wrap it up. Thank you. And so you can go to the next slide. So what we're doing now, actually it was late to this meeting because I just got back from a meeting with Muni Court. We're doing stakeholder meetings to workshop the ideas that came out of this and get people committed to what solutions it is that they think that their organization or they as individuals can commit to doing to move it forward. We're drafting an action plan. So we're likely going to come out of this with 2 to 4 immediate solutions, including right to counsel. The mayor's office has committed to putting funding behind that. We don't know what that's going to look like. If it's going to be a pilot project or like a full-blown ordinance, I don't know. But that will be included in those immediate solutions. And then some number of long-term solutions, or what we're thinking about is like preventing this from, continuing to be a problem. And then obviously implementing those solutions will come next. And we happen to have some people in the room from Youngstown, which is another mid-sized city that is in our service region, and they came up to us afterward and said, we want to do this in Youngstown. So I guess we're going to be taking the show on the road and coalition building out there to hopefully do something next spring. So that's where we stand, and I'm happy to entertain any questions, or I'm sure the organizers of the meeting can share our contact information if you want to talk with Lauren or I. But thank you so much for inviting me to talk today.
Thanks, Maria. I really like how you design this work so you have buy-in from all of the stakeholders that were needed. I hope that means that as you're doing this work and you're putting that plan into action, it means that it'll be stronger and you'll have everyone stay with it towards the end. So maybe you can report back later on as this project is further along down the road, and you can share with us what worked, what didn't work, some lessons learned.
Yeah, we would love that. So be on the lookout. In the next month, we're supposed to have a press conference and propose all this stuff to the community. So yeah, I would love to come back.
Okay, thank you so much for joining with us.
Thanks.
And we're going to go now to our last speaker, Kim Johnson, who will give our Capitol Hill update.
Thanks so much, Sarah, and hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you. Like Sarah said, I'm Kim Johnson. I'm a senior policy analyst here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'm joining today to bring you the latest updates from Capitol Hill. And unsurprisingly, there is, as usual, a lot happening on the Hill, so let's jump right in. So both the House and the Senate are back in session starting tomorrow. And in addition to deciding on the size and scope of a relief package for Ukraine and for the ongoing pandemic, as well as a potential vote in the Senate on abortion legislation, members of Congress are hoping to decide on top-line funding numbers for fiscal year 2023 spending and to determine the outline of a potential reconciliation package. So we can start off with the FY23 update. The appropriations leaders in the House and Senate, so that's Chair Leahy of Vermont and Ranking Member Shelby of Alabama in the Senate, and Chair DeLauro of Connecticut and Ranking Member Granger of Texas in the House. Those four corners met 2 weeks ago to begin negotiations on top line spending numbers for the defense and non-defense discretionary spending packages. Once those top line funding numbers are set, appropriators will have to decide on funding levels for specific subcommittees, which are also known as 302B levels. NLIHC and our partners at the Campaign for Housing and Community Development Funding are circulating our annual 302B letter, which urges Congress to provide the highest possible funding for 302B for 302B level for HUD and USDA's affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs in FY23. We currently have over 1,200 state, local, tribal, and national organizations signed on to that letter. And if your organization has not joined yet, you can do so at the link that my colleague Kayla just dropped in the chat. Thank you so much, Kayla. Appropriators are expected to reach an agreement on those top line 302B allocations by Memorial Day, and draft bills are expected in the House sometime in June with committee markups in July. And that's just where the committee reviews the bills and basically marks them up and votes them out, hopefully, to go on to do a full floor vote in the House. If there are no 302B agreements, the House will still move forward with drafting those bills using the numbers from the President's FY23 budget request as a baseline. In addition to joining the 302B letter, we are also asking advocates to weigh in with their members of Congress to urge them to support NLIHC's top appropriations request for FY23, which include $32.13 billion for the tenant-based rental assistance program, which is enough to renew all existing contracts and to expand housing vouchers to an additional 200,000 households. We're asking for $5.125 billion for the Public Housing Capital Fund to preserve public housing and $5.06 billion for the Public Housing Operating Fund. We're asking for at least $3.6 billion for HUD's Homeless Assistance Grants Program to address the needs of people experiencing homelessness, as well as $100 million for legal assistance to prevent evictions. And finally, we're asking for $300 million for the Competitive Tribal Housing Program, which would be targeted to tribes with the greatest housing needs. Members in the House and Senate have spent the last few weeks circulating Dear Colleague letters with appropriations requests for FY23. And those letters are a way of conveying to appropriations leaders the widespread congressional support for increased funding for particular programs. So we are especially thankful for some of our affordable housing champions in Congress leading Dear Colleague letters to support our appropriations priorities. And that includes Senator Michael Bennet from Colorado, who led a letter in favor of that $100 million for legal aid to prevent evictions. Senator Reed from Rhode Island, who led a letter requesting at least $3.6 billion for homeless assistance grants, as well as that $32.1 billion for tenant-based rental assistance. House Financial Services Committee Chair Maxine Waters led a letter calling for full funding for a Public Housing Operating Fund and at least $5 billion for the Public Housing Capital Fund, along with other important programs. And Representatives Gwen Moore of Wisconsin and John Katko of New York led a bipartisan Dear Colleague letter requesting at least $3.6 billion for HUD's Homeless Assistance Grants Program. In addition to that appropriations advocacy, we are of course continuing to weigh in with members of Congress on the necessity of including targeted affordable housing resources in any reconciliation package that's moving forward. President Biden and Democratic leaders of Congress are working to revive negotiations and enact a significantly scaled down reconciliation bill that can win the approval of West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who has been the single Democratic holdout in the Senate. There is a lot of concern, however, that Senator Manchin will not return to the negotiating table. Instead, the senator has held a couple of meetings with bipartisan group of senators to discuss the possibility of a bipartisan bill to tackle climate change. And there is, of course, concern that trying to negotiate a bipartisan climate deal, which is very unlikely to pass this year, will distract from and further delay the reconciliation process. Senator Manchin has maintained that any future reconciliation package should focus on increasing the federal revenues by changing the tax code and using those revenues to fight inflation and to draw down the federal deficit. The cost of housing is the single largest component of the Consumer Price Index, which is a popular measure of inflation. And so addressing the rising cost of housing is central to decreasing inflationary pressure on households, especially in the long term. It is therefore vital that Congress include in any reconciliation package significant funding for the targeted affordable housing investments that were included in the Build Back Better Act, including the House campaign's top priority. So to recap, that's $25 billion to expand housing vouchers to more than 300,000 households, $65 billion to preserve public housing for its almost 2.2 million residents, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund to build, preserve, and operate more than 150,000 units of affordable, accessible homes for households with the lowest incomes. Congressional Democrats are hoping to reach a deal on the reconciliation outline by Memorial Day and finalize the package before Congress leaves for their August recess. That leaves us about 3 weeks to keep the pressure on Congress to enact a package with significant affordable housing investments. And of course, this timeline may change given the constantly shifting priorities on the Hill. Still, we are urging advocates to contact their senators and representatives and urge them to support the highest funding possible for affordable housing, homelessness, and community development programs in FY23, and to include those housing voucher or include those investments in any budget reconciliation process that's moving forward. You can also use our call-in script to help create your own message to Congress, which I will drop a link to in the chat in just a minute. And organizations can also sign on for, can also take action for increased federal investments in affordable housing by signing on to that 302B letter and joining over 1,800 organizations from around the country to support the historic investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the National Housing Trust Fund in any reconciliation bill that's moving forward. And I will stop there because I know that we are over time. Yeah, happy to answer any questions, but again, I know we're over time.
Thanks so much, Kim. I think we'll leave it there, other than just for me also to encourage people to do what Kim had said and continue to engage with your members of Congress. We're really in a period of time where we should know soon whether Congress is moving forward with a reconciliation bill, and we need to make sure that we're not leaving anything on the table. We are putting it all out there. We're making the hardest push we can to make sure that housing resources are included in any reconciliation bill. So with that, we will end today's call. I appreciate everybody joining on, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thanks, everyone.